Hello, and welcome to this week's lecture for Disability in Media and Literature. I want to cover just a few things, including grading of the first week's discussion board, what we've gone over the last 2 weeks as a reminder, and what we're going to talk about this week in our discussion board. So I graded the first week's discussions. You can go ahead in and see my comments. Most of my comments had to do with making sure you're posting the correct time and the correct number of times. So make sure you do your first post every week by midnight Monday, and then you need 2 more posts by midnight Wednesday. Remember, a week goes from Thursday morning to Wednesday evening. So you need a total of 3 posts on at least 2 different days. I gave you full credit if you gave me 3 posts this week, even if you didn't follow the date routine. I will not do that in the future. And I will allow you to make additional posts if you did not make all 3 posts this week. And that offer is only for this week, and I'd like you to do it within by the end of this week, by the end of week 3. If you have any questions, please send me an email. So the first week we talked about media portrayals of disabled characters and how they're often problematic. You guys gave many different examples of some problematic and some good, but mostly problematic portrayals. They're often stereotyped rather than depicting characters as nuanced and complicated or as human, and they pick on the most obvious feature of a disability and focus on that rather than on the person as a human. The way the character is depicted is often meant to evoke pity. One such characterization that's often mentioned, that's often seen and was mentioned in the readings of our first week, was the disabled saint, an individual with a disability who's expected to be perfect. And certainly that's not a standard that anyone can live up to. Or should be required to live up to because they have a disability, or even in spite of their disability because they need to be extra positive because they're disabled. And that's not fair to anyone, disabled or not disabled. The next week we looked at the movie Me Before You and inspiration porn. The video I had you watch with Stella Young, she was an activist, and she has passed away since doing that video, but she is the one to call attention to this word, inspiration porn, which is the calling of people with disabilities inspirational solely or in part on the basis of their disability. Their disability is what makes them inspirational, rather than them as a whole person making them, inspiring you. The Urban Dictionary has a nice definition of inspiration porn: a portrayal of people with disabilities as one-dimensional, saying to only exist to warm the hearts and open the minds of able-bodied people. You don't exist as a person and with feelings and opportunities and character of yourself you're just the disability, and that disability is there to say, oh my goodness, how wonderful they are, they were able to do this with the disability, and make us able-bodied people, or make, not us, but make able-bodied people feel good about themselves. And Diversity 101, which is I had you read, it says inspiration porn tells the abled audience that people with disabilities exist to make them feel inspired. It removes the focus from the disabled characters and turns them into props that exist entirely to impact abled characters and audience. So it's using them just as a counterpoint, not as a plot point, or not as maybe plot point's not the right word, not as a individual who is involved in their own life and has their own reason for existing. It's just to give a counterpoint against the abled person and make the audience feel inspired. And this leads into what we're going to discuss this week, which is Game of Thrones is used as an example, but it leads to the Tyrion test. And the Tyrion test is a way of looking at whether a movie or a book or even a commercial treats characters or people with disabilities as a foil for the non-disabled, or as individual characters that we're focusing on, instead of being what draws, as it says here, removing the focus from the disabled character. Does it put the focus on the disabled character intentionally and without invoking pity, or making them fully nuanced characters? So the Tyrion test, which you're going to read about in Game of Thrones when you are reading for this week, but there's three parts to it. First is that at least one character with disabilities in a movie, book, etc., is involved in significant plot developments not centered on their disabilities. And the articles that you're going to read talk about how Tyrion is depicted this way. And you may think, if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, that you can't relate to this, but I want you to go beyond Game of Thrones if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, and think about other movies or books, whatever, TV shows, other media that features a disabled character, and think about this Tyrion test and what you've read about the way Tyrion and other disabled characters are portrayed in Game of Thrones in those articles I'm giving you, and apply it to something else. For example, in X-Men we see Charles Xavier, he's in the wheelchair, but he has many abilities and character strengths that have nothing to do with him being in a wheelchair. And the plot developments are not about whether or not he's in the wheelchair, with the possible exception of one movie I can think of that talks about how his abilities and the cure for headaches, and there's a movie where it's either he's got to be in the wheelchair or he has his abilities. But besides that, he's a strong, multidimensional character who actually has significant plot developments that don't center on the fact that he's on a wheelchair. Now, you could argue that perhaps his mutation is a disability, but I don't see that as necessarily a disability. So it's a super ability rather than a disability. So the second part of the Tyrion test is that disabilities are depicted realistically, neither less or more severe than they would be in real life. So it's a realistic portrayal of the disability. It is what it is. It's not exaggerated or underplayed. And oftentimes when you have a stereotypical disability, they're going to focus on one feature of it, and perhaps to evoke more pity, make it seem more difficult or more exaggerated than it really is. So you have to think about how these disabilities are depicted. And number three, that the disabled characters are givers as well as receivers. They're supportive of other characters, not just supported by them. So often when we think of disabled characters, they're being taken care of. They have caregivers. There's somebody always supporting them, always helping them. But do they, in turn, reciprocate? So if we go back again to X-Men, in X-Men, Xavier provides moral support, intelligence, and other attributes to support the other characters. In fact, if you think of an early X-Men, it's Wolverine, who appears to have no limits to what he can do, can't be killed, is super strong, etc., leans on Professor X for moral support and for help, and for help understanding who he is and where he came from. So it describes a richness in these characters that is not there in a stereotyped type of movie. So when you go to answer the discussion question, use examples from other shows if you haven't seen Game of Thrones. If you have seen Game of Thrones, you can discuss what's depicted there, and particularly if anything's changed, since I believe these articles are at least a couple years old and there have been developments that may change your agreement or disagreement with what's in the articles. So thank you very much, and I will see you on the discussion boards.